Get ready for heart-pounding action as our brave mountain rescuer charges headlong into an inferno to save a mysterious alien woman whose life hangs by a thread. Sounds impossible, right? Yet that's only the beginning. This story is packed with pulse-racing chases, staggering reveals, and a high-stakes plan to liberate an entire planet from a looming threat. You won't believe the twists that unfold, or the unlikely bonds forged between human heroes and alien rebels. Curious about how it all turns out? Stick around until the end to discover every last secret. Trust us, once you dive in, you won't want to miss a single moment of this incredible journey. And before we set off on this epic adventure, please remember to subscribe to our channel. It's the best way to show your support and guarantee you'll never miss out on more thrilling stories like this one. Hit that notification bell and settle in for a breathtaking ride. The first explosion tore the early morning sky like a jagged wound, rousing Bren Malvik from a fitful doze at his cramped one-room cabin halfway up Greyblade Peak. He'd been hunched over a battered thermos of coffee, still wearing the harness from his last rescue climb, when the blast rattled his windows so hard a few old certificates clattered to the floor. Outside, darkness was on the cusp of yielding to dawn, yet the brilliance of the detonation swallowed up any hint of natural light. Bren's breath caught. He already knew the epicenter, the Ataran research facility nestled just beyond the next ridge. In normal conditions, the facility was practically invisible, sheathed by advanced camouflage screens and force fields that the Atarans had offered humanity as part of their so-called benevolent alliance. Now that hidden fortress glowed like a bonfire against the black horizon, haloed by billows of smoke. Bren didn't wait for instructions. 10 years on mountain rescue teams had made him averse to waiting for bureaucratic orders, especially from Ataran authorities who rarely understood the mountain's unpredictable nature. Still, his radio crackled to life just as he started pulling on an old, scuffed jacket reinforced with harness loops and carabiners. A commanding Ataran voice announced, "Attention all local emergency responders. Please stand down. The situation at the research facility is under control." Bren paused to glare at the radio. He could practically picture the green-skinned official on the other end, lips pursed, posture rigid in that particular way the Atarans favored whenever they dismissed human initiatives. "Sure it is," Bren muttered. In his experience, "under control" usually signaled panic behind the scenes. It was a phrase used to keep humans docile, to preserve the notion of a flawless partnership between Earth and the Atarans. In truth, the alliance was underpinned by grand Ataran promises, cures for human diseases, cutting-edge environmental technology, even the end of resource scarcity. They had arrived with outstretched hands, proclaiming they wanted nothing but goodwill and cooperation. And for a time, it seemed they truly had saved humanity from a slow, self-inflicted extinction. Yet, tucked behind every miraculous medical facility or advanced farm was a certain Ataran arrogance that seeped into every mission, including the command to remain calm while they handled all emergencies. Most mountain dwellers like Bren could see cracks in that polished facade. The Atarans might excel at futuristic medicine or large-scale engineering, but they were comically ignorant about how to fight a wildfire in a pine-laden forest, or how to navigate winding trails on precarious cliffs. And so, half the time, Bren found himself racing to do the grunt work, while the Atarans offered pristine theoretical solutions, often from behind sterile glass walls. By the time he secured his harness and shouldered a battered medkit, the sky was saturated with swirling plumes of black and orange. A second explosion, less deafening but nearer, boomed across Greyblade Peak. Gritting his teeth, Bren set off at a sprint. The standard route to the research facility took a good 40 minutes for inexperienced hikers, but he had cut that time in half more times than he could count. The old scars on his hands and forearms, knotted from years of rescue missions, were his map. Each ridge, each route, each jagged outcrop was as familiar as breathing. 20 minutes later, Bren slipped around a hairpin turn and got his first clear look at the facility. Its force field shimmered uselessly amid the flames that devoured its sleek walls. The crisp white architecture, designed to evoke harmony and trust, was now a crumpled mess of twisted metal and broken glass. The stench of burning composite materials choked the air, so acrid it brought tears to Bren's eyes. Two Ataran security personnel, their skin displaying the deep emerald hue typical of their species, appeared from behind a shimmering perimeter shield. Their uniforms bore the silver insignia of the Ataran Defense Wing. One of them raised an energy baton in a wordless gesture for Bren to halt. "Stop right there," barked the taller one. His green skin glistened with reflective scales that occasionally caught the flicker of flames. "This is a restricted area. No human entry allowed." Bren lifted the plastic ID card that dangled from his neck, an outdated badge reading, "Bren Malvek, Volunteer Mountain Rescue." He met their eyes. "I'm a rescue specialist. I can help if there are trapped survivors." Typically, his local connections were enough to gain access, but Aterans posted at the facility seldom faced mountain rescues. They clung to their standard protocols instead of trusting local knowledge. "Your services are not required," the same guard replied, voice tinged with condescension. "Please evacuate to a safe distance immediately." At that instant, a keening scream sliced through the air. Bren couldn't tell if it was human or a Taranton, but the raw terror in it propelled him forward. Without another thought, he ducked beneath the guard's raised baton, twisting sideways. Years of scaling cliffs and rescuing tourists from precarious ledges had honed his reflexes. It helped that the guards, though strong, were unprepared for anyone ignoring their direct order. Bren vaulted over a collapsed portion of the outer wall and found himself inside the burning building. A wave of heat smashed against him like a physical assault. Smoke billowed in thick clouds, making his eyes water and his throat sear with each breath. Twisted rebar and slabs of scorched metallic plates formed impromptu obstacles. Nearby consoles sparked with jagged arcs of electricity. Weaving through the case, Bren called out, "Anybody here? Can you hear me?" He stayed close to the floor where the smoke was thinner. Almost immediately, he heard a faint groan coming from deeper in the corridor. He crawled toward the sound, calling again, "Hold on! I'm coming!" Then he spotted her pinned beneath a collapsed beam that was slick with some strange glowing fluid. She was Atrin, yet her skin was unlike any he had seen before. Instead of the uniform dark emerald, it possessed a delicate, shimmering quality, rippling like sunrise over green ocean waves. A thin gash ran across her forehead, dripping a strange silver-hued blood that made Bren's gut tighten with urgency. When her gaze locked on his, eyes the color of molten gold, a jolt of recognition pulsed through him, though he couldn't place why. "You're the human who never took the upgrades," she rasped, forcing out the words even as she winced in pain. Her voice was softer than any Ataran's Bren had heard, almost musical, with none of the clipped superiority that usually grated on him. He set his shoulders against the fallen beam. "Let's hold the cryptic comments for later," he managed, ignoring the complaining burn in his muscles. "We need to get this off you." It took every ounce of Bren's strength to shift the chunk of metal off the Ataran woman's leg. The corridor around them glowed bright orange, the flicker of flames dancing across the battered walls. At one point, his boot slipped on shards of glass, nearly sending him sprawling. But Bren stabilized, heaved again, and finally found a wedge point that allowed the beam to tilt just enough. "Try sliding out," he shouted, the roar of fire and structural groans making conversation nearly impossible. She sucked in a breath through clenched teeth, then dragged herself free. Bren immediately dropped the beam back with a thunderous crash. He leaned over, hooking a shoulder beneath her arm to keep her upright. Up close, she was startlingly slender, yet she carried herself with a certain poise, like she was used to moving with deliberate grace. Her skin, pale green at the moment, shimmered even through the grime and soot. "Name's Bren," he said, trying to keep her conscious. He couldn't help noticing the gash on her forehead was bleeding silver onto her cheek. "What's yours?" Her eyelids fluttered. "Rhina. I'm called Rhina," she managed. Pain wove through every syllable, but a flicker of determination lit her eyes. "You don't know what you're getting into." Then, as if she recalled something urgent, her gaze darted around. "We can't stay. Others, they'll come." Bren stiffened, hearing footfalls in the distance, likely more security forces or an Ataran extraction squad. He had no illusions about their intentions. Everything about the Ataran reaction so far suggested they wanted to keep this under wraps. "We'll get out," he assured her. The building groaned as overhead supports threatened to collapse. "Let's move." Helping Rhina walk proved difficult. She favored her left leg, but couldn't put much weight on the right, which was scorched along her calf. Smoke made their eyes sting. Sparks hissed from severed cables. At the next junction, Bren found the main corridor blocked by debris and molten metal. "We'll have to find another way," he muttered, scanning for some sign of an auxiliary exit. Her slender fingers gripped his shoulder. "Maintenance shaft," she said, voice hoarse. "Left, then down, maybe 60 meters." She coughed, pressing her free hand to the wound on her head. "It connects to the outer mountain face. It's rarely monitored." "Sounds perfect," Bren answered, though privately he wondered if any path in this collapsing structure could be considered perfect. Every so often, shouts echoed, Adaran voices edging closer. He tried to keep Rhina moving as quickly as possible without further injuring her. Occasionally, she muttered under her breath, something about him risking his life for someone who was still part of the system. Bren wasn't entirely sure what she meant, but he guessed that system referred to the much-lauded Adaran-Human alliance. Even if she was Ataran, she clearly knew something was very wrong here. At last, they reached a sealed hatch labeled with unfamiliar Ataran script. With his free hand, Bren slammed the hatch's manual release lever. Mercifully, it parted. He peered into a narrow vertical shaft lit by the dull red glow of emergency lights. Maintenance rungs ran down the wall. "After you," he said, forcing a grin, even though his pulse hammered. Heights didn't usually scare him, but a fall in such a confined space could be deadly. Rhina's lip quirked, though the gesture was more wry than amused. "If I fall, it's on you to catch me." They climbed down slowly, Bren supporting Rhina as she tried to descend rung by rung. Below them, darkness seemed to yawn forever. Each time he glanced upward, he caught glimpses of swirling smoke and the ghostly glow of flickering fires silhouetting the opening. Every clang of metal from above sent an echo reverberating down the shaft. Bren wondered just how long it would be before the entire facility caved in, or the Atran search teams discovered this corridor. After about 20 meters of careful descent, Rhina suddenly tensed. "Stop," she whispered, halting so abruptly that Bren nearly lost his balance. He pressed his back against the shaft's metal wall, boots wedged onto a narrow rung. "Voices," she murmured, tilting her head upward. Sure enough, Bren caught faint echoes. Maintenance access must be checked. No survivors can leave without clearance. The speaker's tone, dispassionate and methodical, carried an edge of finality that made Bren's skin crawl. "We have to keep going," he whispered back, though he understood why Rhina was worried. If the Atrans came down the rungs now, they'd be cornered. She swallowed, her luminous eyes meeting his, worry flickering beneath her exhaustion. Then she nodded. Clinging to the ladder, they moved quicker, ignoring the stabbing pains that must have plagued her leg. Somewhere above them, footsteps rattled the metal rungs. A second voice snapped, "Hurry!" It was only a matter of moments before they'd be spotted. Bren felt his pulse spike. He scanned the shaft for possible escape routes. The walls were unbroken except for a faint seam or two that might indicate compartments, but nothing big enough to hide in. The only option was to keep descending and possibly outpace the pursuers, or leap in a controlled fall. He recalled a common safety feature in older mines and industrial complexes: emergency brake systems built into the shafts. By design, they'd slow someone who fell or jumped from the rungs. He shouted a quick explanation to Rhina, adrenaline pumping. "We're going to drop." Her eyes widened, but she gave a shaky nod. The footsteps above grew louder. Holding her tightly, Bren let go of the rung. Gravity yanked them downward in a rush of searing wind. Rhina let out a strangled gasp, clinging to him. For a split second, they hurtled into near-total darkness. Then, with a thunderous clank, the emergency brakes engaged. Metal rods shot out from the sides of the shaft, catching on the rung rails and slowing their fall, just enough to avoid instant death. The first brake gave way under their combined weight, snapping with a shriek of twisting metal, and they dropped another 10 meters in a heart-stopping freefall before the second brake kicked in. That one held. They hit the floor with a bone-rattling impact, Bren twisting midair to cradle Rhina against his chest. He tasted blood in his mouth, probably from biting his tongue. Yet the immediate danger was overshadowed by urgent necessity, the next corridor leading out of the shaft. A single overhead lamp glowed dimly, offering just enough light to see an arched metal door. Above them, angry shouting reverberated. Check the floor. They might have survived. Bren half-carried, half-supported Rhina to the door. She panted, leaning against him, her luminous skin gone pale except for the flicker of green along her temples. The door had a manual crank latch, a relic from older designs, so Bren wrestled it open. Fresh air blasted in, crisp but tinged with the tang of burning machinery. The corridor beyond was short, leading to a small external landing that jutted out of the mountain slope. An overhead sign, etched in Ataran script, probably indicated some maintenance route that looped to an outcropping outside. They stumbled onto the landing, the sky now touched by the first light of dawn. From this vantage, the rising sun painted the opposite mountain range in purple and pink hues, a stark contrast to the soot-stained chaos behind them. Before they could appreciate the vista, Rhina's knees buckled. Bren clutched her waist to keep her upright. "I've got you," he murmured. Silvery blood still trickled from her forehead, and her right calf looked badly burned. She might have had internal injuries too, for all he knew. He rifled through his rescue kit, stocked mostly for humans, pulling out sterile gauze and an antibiotic spray. "Your physiology's different, but I can at least clean and bandage that cut," he said, voice gentle. She lowered her head in exhaustion. "Any help is better than nothing," she whispered. As Bren worked quickly, pressing gauze to stanch the bleeding, she let out a trembling exhale. "Thank you," she said, golden eyes lifting to meet his. "I mean it." He flashed a half smile. "I'm not in the habit of leaving people to burn, no matter their species." He realized with a pang that some humans certainly would, especially if it meant defying Ataran authorities. Yet this felt right. He couldn't pinpoint why, but something about Rhina's vulnerability and the faint kindness in her voice made it impossible for him to remain detached. They had to move. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor behind. "There's a narrow pass that loops around the ridge," Bren explained, helping her stand. "It leads to my cabin. Not exactly well stocked for an alien, but it's secure. Shielded, too, from prying eyes." He hoped that part was true. It was more a patchwork of various stealth modifications he'd slapped together over the years, but it had saved him from Ataran's scrutiny before. Rhina nodded, her eyes sparking at the mention of a safe haven. A hiss from behind made them both spin. An Ataran guard had reached the door, leveling a plasma rifle. Instantly, Bren swept Rhina behind him and rolled sideways, scooping up a piece of fallen metal debris. He hurled it at the guard. The improvised projectile slammed into the rifle. The shot went wide, carving a molten gouge in the wall. Before the guard could recover, Bren seized Rhina's arm, and together they sprinted across the small landing. With a grunt, Bren kicked through a half-broken emergency exit panel. A gust of cold mountain wind whipped around them. They scrambled onto a rocky ledge, barely wide enough for a single person. Bren clung to outcroppings, scanning for the best path forward. When he found a traverse route, he guided Rhina carefully, mindful that any slip would send them plummeting hundreds of meters. Overhead, more guard voices shouted. Alarm klaxons wailed. By the time the pair reached a rough-cut crevice leading into the mountain's interior, both were drenched in sweat despite the brisk air. This natural tunnel was Bren's secret, a labyrinthine cave network layered with mineral deposits that distorted Ataran scanners. He had used it countless times to move around discreetly. Slipping inside, Bren exhaled relief. If the Atarans had any sense, they'd guess he'd head somewhere like this, but he doubted they'd manage the labyrinth with the same ease. It took nearly an hour to pick their way through the cave system's cramped passages. The going was slow, with Rhina limping and Bren stopping often to help her navigate uneven ground. Limestone formations dripped icy water. Occasionally, a faint trickle of an underground stream hinted at new tunnels branching off deeper into the mountainside. Every so often, they'd pause to listen for pursuers, hearts pounding, but all they heard was the rhythmic drip of stalactites in their own ragged breathing. Despite the adrenaline and fatigue, Bren noticed something curious. The subtle glow emanating from Rhina's skin seemed to dim and brighten with her emotions. When she braced herself to climb over a slick boulder, the glow pulsed anxiously. When she leaned against a cavern wall to rest, it steadied, softly illuminating the stone. The Atarans he'd encountered before always carried themselves with aloof composure, their emotions subdued or even artificially modulated. Rhina, on the other hand, was raw, human-like in her vulnerability. They reached a place where the ceiling widened, forming a small chamber. Bren guided Rhina to a flat rock so she could sit. "We can spare 5 minutes before continuing," he said, pulling out a small LED flashlight and shining it over her injuries. The bandage on her leg was soaked with an odd mix of dried silver blood and the antibiotic solution. But at least the bleeding had slowed. Her forehead still looked nasty, though. "Let me redress that cut," he offered. She nodded, wincing slightly. As he worked, he couldn't hold back a question that had been gnawing at him since they fled the facility. "What were you doing in there? That place is sealed tighter than a fortress, and it sure sounds like your own people are after you." She tensed, her shoulders drawing inward. For a moment, Bren thought she might refuse to answer, but then she exhaled shakily. I was part of the project. My father, Kolar, oversees the Earth Integration Directorate. He's one of the highest-ranking officials in the Ataran Council. I grew up believing our mission was purely benevolent, that we were offering humanity a new chance. Her eyes flickered with regret. But I saw data, confidential research logs, that shattered the official story. Turns out every new Ataran innovation gifted to humanity comes with hidden strings, subtle genetic modifications in your medical treatments, or coded dependencies in your energy infrastructure. We're not just helping, we're systematically shaping your species according to my father's design. Bren felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle. He'd always suspected the partnership was too good to be true. "What did you find that made you turn against your own father?" "Something big," she said, voice low. "Something I tried to expose. The reason that facility burned tonight wasn't an accident. I sabotaged part of it. Stole a data crystal with, well, let's say it contains more than just instructions. It has override codes that could, in the right hands, unravel the entire Ataran hold on Earth, shut down forced compliance programs, reveal the truth behind what's happening in your medical centers, everything. But the rest of the directorate wants me dead or neutralized before I can use it." Bren's jaw tightened. He recalled the haunted look on his mother's face after she'd gone through an Ataran medical optimization. She'd survived cancer, yes, but had become so eerily calm it was as though someone had turned off parts of her personality. He had chafed against the system ever since. Staring at Rhina's battered form, he felt a surge of protectiveness. If that crystal can help break humanity's dependence, then I'm in. Let's get you somewhere safe so we can figure out how to use it. Rhina's lips curved into a faint, grateful smile. "You don't even know me. You don't know what I've done or if I can be trusted." He shrugged, biting back any confusion he felt. "I saw a vulnerable person in a fire, and I pulled you out. That's all I need to know right now." They continued through the final leg of the cavern, emerging at last into the pale daylight filtering over the mountains. Outside, the crisp air smelled of pine and faintly of burnt chemicals drifting from the distant facility. Bren guided Rhina along a narrow, overgrown trail, carefully watching for any sign of pursuit. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape began tapering off, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion in both of them. He offered her water, which she sipped thankfully, though she grimaced at the pain in her leg. Eventually, the trail dipped into a small clearing, revealing the unobtrusive shape of Bren's cabin. It was little more than a sturdy wooden structure perched on a rocky outcrop, surrounded by tall trees and half-buried camouflage netting. Runic symbols, actually circuit-laced patches, were attached to the walls to scramble Ataran scanning equipment. Bren had cobbled it all together over years of frustration with the official protocols. Even so, it resembled a humble mountain hideaway more than a high-tech fortress. Once inside, Bren helped Rhina onto a worn cot in the corner. A battered wooden table stood near the window, cluttered with climbing ropes, half-empty coffee mugs, and a second-hand computer rig. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but it's off the Ataran grid, for the most part." Rhina's head sank into a makeshift pillow. She let out a breath she'd clearly been holding for hours. "It's perfect," she whispered, eyes drifting shut. The cabin's cozy warmth contrasted sharply with the inferno they'd fled. For a moment, a fragile peace settled over them. Bren busied himself rummaging through medical supplies, checking if any human antibiotics or bandages might be safe enough for Ataran physiology. He was no doctor, but at least he had some knowledge from treating hikers with serious wounds. He placed a cool compress on her forehead, hoping it might stem infection. As he did so, a metallic glint caught his eye. Something had slipped from her torn clothing. It was a small data crystal etched with intricate Ataran symbols. Bren's heart kicked up a notch. This must be the object she'd spoken of, the key to unmasking the entire Ataran operation. He picked it up, noticing the faint hum it emitted, as if responding to an unseen frequency. Carefully, he tucked it away in a tin box near his desk. 3 hours passed as Rhina drifted between restless sleep and half-conscious murmurs. Bren kept watch, occasionally checking a jury-rigged screen that tapped into local Ataran transmissions. Nothing definitive yet, just chatter about a disturbance at the facility. At one point, an Ataran voice commanded all search squads to stand down, implying they'd accounted for any casualties. "They must think you died in the explosion," Bren muttered under his breath, glancing at Rhina. That could buy them time. But his brief sense of relief shattered when another alert popped up on his console. Elia Morton, the local clinic administrator who'd fully embraced Ataran medical technology, was leading a search detail up the mountain. She'd likely come under direct orders from the directorate. Damn, Bren swore, flipping a switch to kill the cabin's outside lighting. He half-limped to the cot, nudging Rhina gently. "We've got company. Can you move if you have to?" She blinked, disoriented, but forced a nod. Yes. He eyed the entrance. He had a cramped underground storage space built to hide contraband gear. Maybe it would suffice. Heavy footsteps on the birch made his skin crawl. "Quickly," he whispered, helping her toward the concealed basement hatch. "Stay as still as possible. I'll handle this." With that, he eased the panel shut and stood, heart pounding as he faced the sound of a sharp knock on his door. Elia Morton's sharp knock echoed like a gavel in Bren's tiny cabin. He straightened his shoulders, steadying his breath before crossing to the door. Through a slender gap in the window shutters, he glimpsed Elia's form. She looked deceptively calm, her short, efficient strides, the impeccable alignment of her posture. Since fully embracing Ataran medical enhancements, Elia had ascended from a mere nurse at the old local clinic to someone the whole region considered a model citizen. Gone was the timid woman who once trembled during winter storm warnings. In her place stood this almost placid figure, as though the genetic adjustments had streamlined her personality. He turned the knob just as she raised her hand for a second rap. "Elia," Bren greeted, trying to sound nonchalant. "It's early, even for you." She offered a tight-lipped smile, the corners of her mouth not quite reaching her eyes. "Good morning, Bren. We're conducting a safety survey in light of the incident at the Ataran facility." She stepped forward without waiting for an invitation, her keen gaze darting around the cluttered room. "You live up here alone, so close to the blast zone. We want to ensure you weren't hurt and that you're not housing any trouble." Bren faked a yawn, refusing to budge from the doorway. "I'm fine," he said bluntly. "Heard the explosions, but I knew the Atarans would handle it." He gestured vaguely at the scuffed harness and ropes stacked on a crate. "I was about to head out for an early climb." Elia's eyes flicked over the harness, to the half-open chest of drawers, and to the floor near the cot. "Were you now?" Her polite tone carried an edge of artificial sincerity, as though part of her was reading from a script. "The facility's damage appears extensive. The Atarans reported it might take days to secure. So please, Bren, stay away. We wouldn't want you stumbling onto anything beyond your expertise." He felt the implicit warning. His throat tightened as his mind drifted to Rhina, concealed mere feet below them behind a panel of old oak boards. A flicker of movement under Elia's crisp jacket made Bren suspect she wore some kind of scanner device. "Sure," he replied with forced lightness. "I'll keep to my usual routes. No heroic stunts." Elia nodded, satisfied for the moment. She extended her arm, pressing a small metallic disc into Bren's hand. "An emergency signal," she said, voice dropping in volume. "Should you see anything or anyone that seems out of place, activate it. If you don't," her gaze hardened fractionally, "let's just say it's in everyone's best interest to remain cooperative with the Atarans. We owe them a great deal." She paused as though expecting him to protest. When he remained silent, she allowed a faint, clinical smile. "Take care, Bren." She pivoted on her heel and strode away, leaving the door open behind her. Only when her silhouette vanished into the swirling morning mist did he exhale. Swiftly he closed and bolted the door, crossing to the hidden hatch. With careful deliberation, he eased it open. Rhina blinked up at him, tension etched on her face. "We're clear," Bren assured in a low voice. "But we won't be safe here for long. She suspects something. Might be a matter of hours before they send a full search squad." Rhina's expression was grim. "We need time to decode the crystal, and we can't stay if that woman is monitoring you." Bren opened his palm, showing her the metallic disc. "Elia told me to call if I saw anything suspicious." He set it aside, jaw taut. "Let's use their own device against them. I've got a place in mind where we can find allies who know how to jam these signals or repurpose them." Once the coast was clear, Bren led Rhina out of the cabin through a narrow side door that opened onto a camouflage footpath. The dawn sky had fully asserted itself by now, burning off any lingering haze with golden light. Treacherous slopes ringed the property, scattered with fir trees and jutting boulders. It was terrain designed to deter casual visitors, though not enough to fool a determined Ataran patrol. They had to move. Rhina tested her weight on her injured leg, wincing. "Better than before," she murmured, though Bren noticed the tightness in her voice. His makeshift bandages had slowed the bleeding, but her movements were stiff. "I've got you," he said, gently offering an arm for support. Her luminous eyes flicked to him in acknowledgement. The contact of her fingers against his forearm sent an unexpected current of warmth through him, so different from the cold standoffishness he associated with other Atarans. They moved at a brisk but cautious pace, weaving among ancient pines. Neither spoke much at first. The hush of the morning forest felt both serene and precarious, as though the world were holding its breath. Bren kept glancing upward, half expecting an Ataran hovercraft to zip overhead. The presence of Elia had rattled him more than he'd admit. If the local clinic admin was part of the effort to recapture Rhina, that meant an extensive infiltration of their little mountain community. Nearly a mile from the cabin, they reached a hidden vantage point where the slope dipped dramatically into a ravine. In the distance, the faint hum of vehicle engines drifted up from the winding mountain road. Bren set a cautious foot on an overhang, pulled out a compact set of binoculars, and scanned. He spotted two unmarked trucks parked near an abandoned mine entrance. Dark-clad figures milled around, carrying gear that definitely wasn't standard Ataran issue. Rhina leaned in. "That's not any Ataran patrol I know," she said, voice tinged with surprise. "Their stance, their equipment, looks more old-world militaristic." "Human paramilitary," Bren guessed. "But it's unusual. Most armed groups got absorbed or disbanded once the Atarans provided universal peace treaties. So what are they doing out here?" An ominous boom echoed inside the mine shaft, sending a plume of dust into the air. The figures in black didn't flinch. They simply continued unloading crates. Bren's stomach twisted. This doesn't look like a friendly group. We'd better detour around them. Rhina's fingers tightened on his arm, her skin flaring with a subtle glow. "Wait," she peered again. The man standing at the entrance, Commander Vaus. Her face darkened. "He works directly for my father, Kolar. He's a ruthless enforcer. If he's here, something massive is in the works." Bren frowned. "So those paramilitary humans might be under his control, another layer to whatever plan the Directorate has?" "Yes," Rhina replied bitterly. "And if Vaus is on site, we're in double jeopardy. He doesn't just want me silenced. He enjoys carrying out punishments." Bren lowered the binoculars, a sense of urgency mounting. "Then we definitely avoid them. I have a second route that'll take us to a group of folks who might help decode the crystal and keep you safe. They're not exactly your father's fans." Rhina nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. "Lead on, Bren." Circling wide around the old mine site, they descended into a denser part of the forest where the pines grew taller and lichen clung to the trunks in thick, spongy patches. Shafts of sunlight poked through the canopy, illuminating swirling motes of dust. Bren set a careful pace to accommodate Rhina's leg, occasionally pausing to check the old GPS unit he kept clipped to his belt. The device was shielded against Ataran signals, yet ironically contained enough salvaged Ataran parts to make it more reliable than pre-invasion tech. They traveled in silence for much of the morning, mindful of potential pursuit. At times, Rhina asked quiet questions about the terrain or some piece of old human equipment they passed, like a rusted radio tower that poked above the treetops. Her curiosity was sharp, tinted with sadness whenever the conversation drifted back to how so many of humanity's old systems had been dismantled in favor of Ateron technology. By midday, Bren guided her toward a hidden pocket of granite cliffs. Tucked against the rock face was an unassuming metal door, half camouflaged by moss and vines. A small keypad blinked red. Bren entered a code, and the door hissed open, revealing a tunnel slanting down into dim, cool depths. Subterranean workshop, he explained quietly, belongs to Kessler and Ewan, two ex-military engineers who never fully trusted the Alliance. They keep a low profile, but if they're here, they'll be able to help us. Rhina nodded, wincing as she gingerly stepped inside. The corridor smelled of wet stone and stale machinery. They reached another security checkpoint, this one a basic old-fashioned lock, and Bren used a key. Beyond it lay a spacious cavern lit by generator-powered lamps. Makeshift tables held half-assembled drones, mechanical arms, circuit boards, and disassembled Ateran scanners. A wiry man in grease-stained coveralls popped up from behind a bench. His hair was buzzed, short, and a rag was slung over his shoulder. "Bren Malvik? Haven't seen you in months. Thought you gave up on us." "Busy rescuing tourists," Bren said with a flicker of a grin. "Kessler around?" The man jerked a thumb toward a tunnel branching off. "Yeah, but who's—" His gaze fell on Rhina, and he froze, noting her green-tinged skin. Aterans weren't frequent visitors, especially not in battered clothing with silver blood caked on. Reflexively, he reached for a sidearm. Bren raised a hand. "She's not a threat. Trust me, Ewan." Ewan narrowed his eyes, glancing between them. "All right, but I want an explanation." They found Kessler in a back chamber, adjusting the power flow to an old generator. When Bren introduced Rhina and provided a rushed summary, the sabotage at the facility, the stolen data crystal, the lethal pursuit by Commander Vaus, Kessler let out a low whistle. He was older, with graying hair, and a stoic manner that hid deep cynicism about Aterans. "So you're telling me," Kessler said slowly, "that this crystal can break Earth's reliance on Ateran tech, but it might also cripple life support systems if used incorrectly?" Rhina nodded, skin dimming as if overshadowed by guilt. "Yes, that's why we have to decode it carefully. There's a possibility to reconfigure the dependencies rather than simply shut them down outright. I can't do it alone." Ewan stepped forward, eyeing the battered woman's injuries. "I know a bit about Ateran coding. Let me see this crystal. We'll check if we have the right gear to interface." Bren carefully retrieved the tiny crystal from his pack. As Ewan examined it, Kessler folded his arms. "If Commander Vaus is out there, he'll be on our trail soon." His gaze flicked to a cluster of monitors. "We're too close for comfort. We might need to move our entire operation." "That would take weeks," Ewan said. "We'll have to move faster. Let me see if we can at least start decrypting." The pair set up an impromptu workstation with a battered old computer tower, wired to a jury-rigged Ateran console. Rhina stood to the side, wincing every so often as her injured leg bore weight. While Ewan navigated lines of alien script flickering across the monitors, Kessler rummaged in a steel cabinet, emerging with a battered medical kit. "Bren," he said, jerking his head in Renault's direction, "patch her up with this. These bandages are laced with a mild antibiotic that's not entirely human-based. It might help her faster than your standard kit." Rhina offered a word of gratitude, her expression veiled by a mixture of wariness and relief. Bren couldn't blame her for being on edge. While Kessler and Ewan were no fans of Aterans, they'd seen too many miracles turn into infiltration tools. Trust would not come easy. Still, they had no alternative. A doctor in town would report them in a heartbeat, especially with Elia Morton orchestrating searches. Pulling Rhina aside to a quieter corner, Bren had her sit on a metal bench. He unwrapped the soiled bandage around her thigh, took a breath at the sight of her raw burns, and did his best to clean and redress them with the antiseptic-laced pads Kessler provided. Even in the dim artificial light, her skin looked too pale. The green undertones dulled. Guilt stabbed at him for forcing her to walk so far on such an injury, but they'd had no choice. At one point, she inhaled sharply, eyes brimming with pain. Bren set his hand lightly on her shoulder. I'm sorry, he said, softly, smoothing the fresh bandage. Wish we could do more for the pain. She shook her head. It's all right, I've been taught to handle discomfort. Then her eyes flickered with something that looked like sorrow. The Ataran way is to suppress vulnerabilities. Makes everything so cold, so numb sometimes. When I was trapped back there, I realized I didn't want that anymore. Pain means I'm alive, that there's something worth fighting for. A lump formed in Bren's throat. He thought of how so many people, like Alaya or his own mother, had upgraded themselves into near-emotionless existences, content to function in a pristine shell. I get it, he murmured. Numbness isn't living. Their moment was interrupted by an abrupt, got it, from Ewan. He beckoned them over. I've bypassed the first encryption layer, he said, tapping the screen. Alien characters cascaded downward. Rhina, see if you can guide me. The subroutines are partially biologically keyed. That means they're expecting some kind of neural handshake, probably an Ataran metric. Rhina leaned in, eyes scanning the code. Yes, that's to ensure only authorized persons can access certain files. But I added a twist. It also needs a human neural imprint. It's a security measure I built so that no one side, Ataran or human, could force the system alone. She glanced at Bren. It's why I need you, or someone like you. Kessler exhaled in disbelief. So you're telling me you deliberately made a key that only works if an Ataran and a trustworthy human combine their biosignals? Bren felt Rhina's gaze lock on him. Yes, she said softly. It's the only way. Before anyone could discuss next steps, a klaxon-like siren blared from Kessler's makeshift security rig. The old monitors near the tunnel entrance flickered to life, showing half a dozen armed figures stepping through the outer door. At their helm was a tall, broad-shouldered Ataran with sharp, angular features and a uniform bearing the directorate insignia. A subvocal translator patch gleamed on his collar. Vaus, Rhina breathed, her voice taut with fear. The name slithered through the air like a curse. He'd found them, and fast. Kessler cursed under his breath, hitting a switch to seal the inner blast door. On screen, Vaus lifted an energy baton and beckoned his subordinates, who appeared human but moved in that eerily synchronized way that suggested neural modifications, possibly microchips or partial reprogramming. He's got hybrids, Ewan spat. Damn it, they'll cut through that door eventually. Rhina's throat tightened and her glow flickered. We have to leave, or else finish the decode now. Neither is an immediate option, Ewan snapped. We need at least a few more minutes to get the next layer of encryption down. A dull thud reverberated through the corridor, followed by a sizzling hum, as if some high-energy cutter was being applied to the blast door. Sparks flew on the monitor feed. Bren's mind raced. They had a half-dozen half-robotic goons plus an elite commander ready to storm in, and all they had for defense were a few rifles, a handful of improvised EMP grenades, and a generator-laden workshop that was basically a giant target. Ewan, keep working on that code, Kessler ordered, face set. Bren, you've run rescue missions in these tunnels before. You know any back exits? There's a ventilation shaft that leads a quarter-mile out into the forest, Bren replied, voice tight. But it's a crawl space and will be exposed once we exit. Kessler's jaw worked as he absorbed this. Still better than getting pinned down. We can rig the generator to blow once they breach. Give us a distraction. Or maybe cut their power if we're lucky. Rhina turned to Bren, her eyes reflecting a swirl of fear and determination. You go. Take the crystal. If Commander Vaus gets his hands on it, everything is lost. Ewan can handle the data on a separate device. I'll stall them. Are you out of your mind? Bren retorted, bristling at the suggestion. You're in no shape to stall anyone, especially not Vaus. She steadied herself, her battered leg trembling. He underestimates me. He thinks I'm nothing but a traitor, a liability. If I stay behind, I can distract him long enough for you to escape with the crystal and the partial decode. Not happening, Bren growled. He exchanged a look with Kessler, who merely shrugged, leaving the decision to them. We stick together until we exhaust every option. Understand? The tension was abruptly shattered by a massive clang. The blast door in the footage was warping inward. Time's nearly up, Kessler muttered, hooking a large pack of supplies over his shoulder. Ewan, you got 60 seconds. Then we retreat. If they catch us, this entire mountain might as well belong to the directorate. With frantic speed, Ewan typed commands into the console, occasionally cursing under his breath. Finally, he yanked a small drive from a side port. Got a partial decode, maybe enough to give us a chance. Full decryption will require that neural handshake, though. He thrust the drive at Bren. Hold on to this for dear life. As Ewan stuffed the drive into Bren's hand, Kessler was already throwing open a hatch near the back of the chamber. A draft of musty air swirled in. Ventilation tunnel, he said curtly. We go one at a time. Rhina first, then Bren. Ewan, you follow with the gear. I'll arm the booby traps and bring up the rear. Rhina clenched her jaw. Ignoring her leg's protests, she scrambled into the tunnel entrance. The space was barely a meter high. She had to crawl on hands and knees. With a determined look, Bren followed. Cold metal scraped his shoulders as he wriggled through, the overhead ductwork reverberating with each shift of his weight. Behind them, the workshop exploded into noise. A sudden crash, shouts, blasts of energy weapons. Then came Kessler's gravelly voice bellowing, "Get out of here!" as electrical arcs lit up the security monitors. Commander Vaus must have forced an entry. Bren's heart thundered at the thought of leaving someone behind to face the Adiron enforcer. Rhina paused ahead, glancing over her shoulder with worry etched on her face. Kessler, she began, but Bren shook his head. He knows what he's doing, he said firmly. We need to trust him. They pressed on for what felt like an eternity, scraping through rusted duct passages that occasionally branched into dead ends or downward slopes. Twice they stopped to listen to distant echoes, the clang of footsteps, muffled curses. It seemed Vaus's troops had discovered the vent system too, but the labyrinthine layout slowed their advance. Eventually, Rhina reached a vertical shaft. A narrow ladder-like set of rungs climbed upwards. She tested it gingerly, testing her leg's ability to hold weight. With a deep breath, she pushed upward. Bren hovered below, ready to catch her if she slipped. Once or twice, she hissed with pain but kept going. Ewan followed next, lugging a heavy satchel of electronics. The sound of dislodged dust and rattling metal accompanied them. By the time they emerged from the upper vent, sunlight burned Bren's eyes. They stumbled onto a grassy ledge, battered and exhausted. The breeze felt like a gift. Ewan quickly scanned the horizon while Rhina leaned against a rock, panting. Bren shielded his eyes to get his bearings, recognizing a ridgeline not far from where they'd glimpsed the paramilitary trucks that morning. Now what? Ewan asked, though it was more of a rhetorical demand than a genuine question. We can't just run aimlessly. Vaus's men are in the tunnels below, and if they track us out here... A distant explosion from within the mountains shook the ledge beneath their feet. Smoke belched from multiple rock fissures. Kessler's booby traps must have triggered. The entire slope rumbled, and even from outside, Bren could hear rocky debris collapsing. If Kessler had survived, he'd be working another route out. But for now, they had to assume they were on their own. Rhina wiped sweat from her forehead, eyes flicking to the bag Ewan carried. Do we have everything we need to finish the decode? Most of it, Ewan confirmed, but the final sequences won't unlock without your built-in security measure. The Ataran human neural handshake, whatever that specifically means. We can rig up an interface if we find a stable power source in a safe place. That might be the tricky part. The mention of the neural handshake made Bren's stomach tighten. He glanced at Rhina. She'd told him it required more than just physical contact. It demanded genuine trust, a melding of intentions. To him, it sounded borderline impossible, especially under these conditions. Yet he also felt a strange pull, a sense that everything, Earth's future, possibly the Ataran's future too, depended on forging that connection. We'll figure it out, Rhina said quietly as though reading his thoughts. Her gaze drifted to the horizon where a plume of smoke rose from the remnants of the research facility. But we won't do it alone. Bren followed her line of sight. Who else can help us? She hesitated, eyes reflecting a swirl of grief and hope. My mother, Naraya. At his puzzled look, she explained, she vanished 3 years ago, officially listed as deceased. But I have reason to believe she faked her death after confronting my father's directorate. There are rumors she's been forming her own resistance faction. If she's still alive, she might hold the final piece we need. Ewan snorted. Another missing a Terran with insider knowledge. Great. Where exactly do we find her? Rhina managed a faint, determined smile. She was last rumored to be operating out of a hidden base near the old Riverstone mines. If that rumor's true, we're not far. Bren exchanged glances with Ewan. Then that's our destination, he said. We'll find Naraya, finish decoding the crystal, and stop Vaus, maybe Kolar too, before they escalate whatever plan they're cooking. For the first time in hours, a tiny spark of hope lit Bren's chest. One step at a time, he reminded himself, and he knew, with Rhina at his side, that he'd risk any climb, any peril, to set the world right. Approaching Riverstone mines required caution. Once a thriving source of iron ore, it had been abandoned decades earlier, long before the Atarans arrived. When the Atarans introduced safer extraction techniques, the old mine shafts became obsolete, but rumors suggested certain rebels or outcasts had taken shelter in the labyrinthine tunnels. If Rhina's mother, Naraya, led a resistance group, it made sense they'd pick a place tough for official patrols to navigate. Bren, Rhina, and Ewan traveled under a waning daylight, each footstep weighed by vigilance. Ewan grumbled at their slow pace, but neither Bren nor Rhina could manage more. Between her injured leg and his exhaustion, the best they could do was a steady shuffle. The wind carried a faint smell of sulfur, possibly from geological vents disturbed by the Adarans' environment modifications. At last, they crouched behind a natural rock pillar overlooking a broad canyon. Nestled within it was a squat industrial compound bristling with corroded fences and collapsed scaffolding. The Riverstone mines. Floodlights illuminated pockets of the complex. Shadows flickered between decrepit buildings, but from this distance, it was impossible to tell which shadows were people and which were just illusions cast by sagging structures. "How do we even get inside?" Ewan whispered. "If there's a rebel faction, they won't be eager to let strangers waltz in. And if Vaus or Kalar have their own infiltration units here, we could walk into an ambush." Rhina licked her cracked lips, her skin's glow faint in the dusk. "My mother was rumored to use old Ataran signals to confirm friend from foe. If I can broadcast the right code from a transmitter, she might send someone to check us out." "That's a big if," Bren pointed out. "We don't exactly have a standard Ataran transmitter." She reached into the satchel Ewan carried, rummaging until she produced a circuit board and an antenna-like contraption. "Give me half an hour," she said determinedly. "We can splice this into Ewan's portable rig and create a short-range pulse. If Mom's anywhere in range, she'll notice." Ewan rolled his eyes but nodded. "Let's find cover first. That old service shack looks empty." He pointed to a battered structure perched near an overhang of the canyon. With night falling, it offered a degree of concealment. They huddled inside the shack, which smelled of rust and stale urine. Piles of rotted crates crammed the corners. Ewan set up a dim portable lamp and fussed with his rig, while Rhina began soldering wires with single-minded focus. Bren stood guard by a boarded window, scanning the outside for movement. Time stretched. The only sound was the occasional hiss of Rhina's improvised soldering tool and the scrape of Bren's boots when he shifted position. Anxiety hovered over them all like a looming storm. If Commander Vaus was on the march, they had mere hours, if that, before he discovered this place. And if Naraya's rebels were nearby, would they even respond to a coded pulse? Or mistake them for Directorate spies? Finally, Rhina drew a ragged breath. "All right, I'll send a ping. Let's hope someone's listening." She keyed in a series of sequences on Ewan's console, then pressed a button to activate the makeshift transmitter. Outside, the night deepened, stars faintly visible through drifting clouds. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened, just the soft whir of the portable rig and the faint crackle of static. Bren's pulse thudded in his ears. If no one answered, they'd have to attempt infiltrating the mine's blind. Then a burst of static squealed through the console. "Identify yourself, code reference unknown." The voice, though distorted, carried the unmistakable lilting undertone of an Ataran accent. Rhina's hand trembled on the microphone. "This is Rhina Hel Kolar," she said, using her full name carefully. "Requesting direct contact with Naraya Kolar. Authorization Omega." A hush, then rustling. Some frantic whisper in the background. The next voice was deeper, urgent. "Renahel, confirm your location. Are you alone?" Bren tensed, worried it might be a trap. Rhina bit her lip, glancing at him and Ewan, then spoke into the mic. I have trusted human allies. I bear critical data regarding Earth's compliance program. We seek refuge and an audience with Naraya. Seconds dragged on like leaden weights. Finally, the reply. Stand by. Send your coordinates via burst transmission. Do not move from your position. Then static clicked off. Ewan rubbed his forehead. That's not exactly comforting. Don't move and wait? Bren peered out the gap in the shack's wall. At least it means someone is out there, and they're taking us seriously enough to respond. An hour later, when exhaustion settled heavy in their bones, they heard a faint scrape outside. Before Bren could even raise his weapon, the door eased open. A short, wiry Ataran woman with lime-green skin slipped in silently, accompanied by two human figures. They wore mismatched body armor and carried an assortment of old ballistic weapons. All three had their gazes locked warily on Bren, Ewan, and especially Rhina. The woman spoke first, voice low and resonant. Rhina Hel Kolar, your mother's name is indeed Naraya. She's waiting for you inside the mines. However, she added pointedly, you must come quietly and without sudden moves. We've got watchers posted on every rooftop, ready to neutralize threats. Rhina nodded, stepping forward. We have no intention to fight. We need help, urgently. With minimal conversation, they were led through winding canyon paths to a concealed entrance near the bottom of a ravine. Once inside, the mines opened into a massive vaulted chamber braced by old steel. Lights cobbled from Ataran glow spheres cast a bluish-white sheen on stalactites. Dozens of people, human and Ataran, bustled about, sorting supplies, checking weapons, or monitoring arrays of computers. The entire chamber buzzed with tense energy. Then, at the far side of the cavern, a woman emerged. Her appearance was unmistakably Ataran, elegant bone structure, shimmering green hue. But her face bore a series of faint scars, each telling a story of conflict. She moved with a guarded grace, eyes instantly honing in on Rhina. For a moment, they merely stared across the distance. Rhina's breath caught. Mother, she whispered, voice cracking. Naraya crossed the space in swift strides. She hesitated only a second before pulling Rhina into a tight embrace. Rhina Hel, she murmured, burying her face in her daughter's hair. You're alive. After what happened, I feared the worst. An overwhelming wave of relief and emotion flickered in Rhina's luminous skin, fracturing the harsh stoicism she tried to maintain. When they parted, Naraya's gaze flicked to Bren and Ewan. She noted Bren's protective posture near Rhina and the way Ewan carried the equipment. Her gaze softened fractionally. Friends of yours? Rhina nodded, voice still trembling. Yes, and I have the crystal, Father's worst nightmare if we decode it fully. She pulled it from her pocket. But Vaus is after us, maybe more. We need your help. Naraya's expression hardened. Then we'd best not waste a moment. Welcome all of you to the heart of the Resistance. The first hours at the Resistance base were a blur of hurried strategizing, makeshift medical care, and uneasy reunions. Bren kept Rhina close, guiding her through the throngs of humans and Atarans crowding the mine's central cavern. Dozens of cots lined the chamber's perimeter, each supporting someone wounded in skirmishes with Kolar's forces. Overhead, old steel cables stretched between rock pillars, supporting an array of Ataran glow spheres that bathed the dusty space in stark, bluish light. Naraya led them to a rusted conference room near the far wall, a relic from the mine's administrative past. Its original function was still evident in the chipped metal desk and battered filing cabinets. Now, a large holotable had been erected in the center. Projections of Earth's major cities, overlaid with complex lines of Ataran script, flickered in midair. Resistance members conferred in hushed voices, occasionally shooting sidelong glances at their newcomers. Rhina limped beside Bren, leaning on him for support. She'd been through so much in so little time. Sabotage, escape, near death, and then the shock of reuniting with a mother she'd presumed lost. Though exhaustion tugged at her every step, her golden eyes burned with determination. At the holotable, Naraya tapped a console, silencing the swirling images. An air of tense anticipation filled the room. I never thought we'd be meeting under these conditions, Naraya said, gaze flicking to her daughter. But here we are. We've prepared for this moment. though I'd hoped we'd have more time to refine our approach. She turned to her advisors, an older human man with a prosthetic leg, a young Ataran woman sporting an electronic patch over one eye, and a short-haired human who wore stained cargo fatigues. Each inclined their head, silently deferring to Naraya's lead. Naraya pressed a switch. A schematic of the Ataran global infrastructure spread across the table's surface, strings of data shimmering. We estimate that Kolar, your father, she said, glancing ruefully at Rena, is preparing to implement the final integration of humanity into a neural compliance system. He's calling it Phase Omega. If it happens, free will is done. Each person's consciousness becomes just another node in a grand hive, controlled by a central directive. A murmur of horror rippled among those present. Ewan let out a low curse, crossing his arms. So we're talking about forcibly linking the entire human population to Ataran tech, like slaves. Precisely, Naraya confirmed. Not just slaves, perfect slaves, unaware of their servitude. They'll believe they've achieved some new plateau of harmony, and this time the Directorate's control will be permanent. Rhina swallowed hard, her voice unsteady. He hinted at this years ago, but I never realized the extent. We have the data crystal to prevent it, but we're missing the final step, a secure way to break the compliance programming without shutting off vital life support systems entirely. Millions could die if we simply yank the plug. Bren felt the small drive Ewan had handed him, a partial decode, press against his chest in his shirt's hidden pocket. It was an enormous responsibility to hold the possible key to humanity's future. We can't afford to be reckless, he said. We need a plan that ensures the systems stay online for those who rely on them, like the people who needed those miracle cures, while at the same time freeing everyone from mental domination. That's where your crystal comes in, Naraya said. I've studied enough of our advanced biotech to guess that you constructed a dual biological safeguard, Rhina, one that merges Ataran and human signatures in real time. It's more than just an encryption key, it's a living handshake. Rhina nodded. Yes, but forging that link requires a strong, willing bond between one Ataran and one human. They must synchronize mind to mind. Her gaze slid to Bren. I think that's us. Naraya's expression shifted, torn between pride and concern. You're certain you can make that connection under combat conditions? She asked. Her golden gaze flicked to Bren, and for a moment, it was as though she could peer into his very thoughts. Bren squared his shoulders, aware every eye in the room was on him. If it'll stop Kolar from turning Earth into a hive, I'll do it. His voice held no trace of hesitation, though inside he felt the weight of it all. This was bigger than any rescue climb or personal vendetta against a Terran oppression. This was about the core of humanity, choice, free will, individuality. Ewan, standing at the edge of the table, tapped his foot nervously. We've done a partial decode, but bridging that final stage will require custom hardware. I might be able to rig something together, but it'll take time. We'll need a secure location, a stable power source. Naraya's second-in-command, the older human with the prosthetic leg, chimed in. We have a secure power station deeper in the mine. The ventilation's poor, but we could set up. It's far from perfect, though, and if Kolar's forces breach the outer defenses, he let the implication hang. Then we're cornered, Ewan finished grimly. Naraya inhaled, her posture regal in spite of the tense situation. Alternatively, we have one more option, the old central integration tower at Mistvale. Before the Adarans repurposed it, it was an emergency broadcast station for the entire region. If we get inside, we could use the tower's broadcast array to send the code globally, instantaneously, but it's heavily guarded. It would be a suicidal infiltration, one of the advisors remarked. Kolar's troops have that place locked down, especially now. They know the tower's critical to their final plan. A faint smile tugged at Naraya's lips, though it held no mirth. Which is why I think they'd never expect us to attack it head-on. A small strike team might slip through. If we can secure the top floor, we can integrate the crystal's reconfiguration wave into the existing Ataran network and override the compliance protocols worldwide. Rhina's eyes flared with renewed hope. That wave would reawaken every optimized human, undo neural dampeners, Break forced loyalty. It'd give people back their minds. She glanced at Bren, hesitating just a moment before setting her jaw. I say we try it. The world can't wait for us to hunker down in the mines. Kolar is moving fast. Bren could sense a storm of emotion inside her. She was picturing her father, the unstoppable mastermind behind Earth's infiltration. He reached for her hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. A quiet hush descended, as if everyone recognized how significant this moment was. Naraya placed her palms on the hollow table's edge. All right, we send our best to Mistveil Tower with Rinahel, Bren, and Ewan. I'll dispatch a second unit for distraction. Once you're inside, you'll need to hold off any defenders long enough for the neural handshake to happen. The reconfiguration wave requires stable contact for at least a minute or two. A minute in a firefight can feel like an eternity, Ewan muttered, but there was no going back. Everyone understood the stakes. Naraya nodded. We strike tonight. Gather your gear. Bren, keep Rhina alive. Ewan, guard that partial decode with your life. The rest of us will do what we can to buy you time. That evening, the resistance sprang into action with the precision of a well-rehearsed covert unit. Quieter corridors in the mine bustled with volunteers checking rifles, strapping on bulletproof vests, or carefully packaging leftover Aderon tech that had been repurposed into improvised grenades. Word spread quickly. We're going for the tower. Some greeted the news with excitement, others with barely contained dread, for everyone knew what failure would mean. Bren found himself in a dimly lit chamber that had once been an old supply depot. Its walls were lined with battered shelves of spare cables and mining drills. He fitted a worn bulletproof vest over his thick jacket, though he doubted it would do much against high-end Ataran weaponry. Still, it was better than nothing. Beside him, Ewan adjusted the harness for a bulky device on his back, part battery pack, part code interface. If we lose this, we can't finalize the wave, he explained. I'll rely on you and Rhina to handle the handshake. My job's to keep the gear safe and get it plugged into the tower's mainframe. Rhina stepped in, her movements stiff but determined, guided by the subtle glow that had become her hallmark. She'd traded her tattered clothing for durable fatigues that still bore traces of old Ataran seamwork, giving her a distinctly hybrid appearance. Neither fully human nor strictly Ataran. She carried a small sidearm with trembling fingers. Guns weren't standard in Ataran society, after all. It's heavier than I expected, she muttered, attempting a wry smile. Bren offered a comforting nod. Don't worry, I've got your back. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the impending operation settled between them. There was so much unsaid about how the neural handshake would reveal every piece of themselves to each other, about the possibility that one or both might not survive. He placed his hand gently over hers. Whatever happens, we face it together. She exhaled, a soft tremor in her breath. Together, she agreed. They joined the rest of Naraya's strike team near a camouflaged exit at the eastern edge of the mines. Naraya herself stood at the threshold, clad in a matte black bodysuit woven with stealth threads. The transformation from compassionate rebel leader to seasoned operative was striking. She pulled Rhina into a fierce embrace. When you see your father, she whispered, remember all the good in our people that he's trying to twist. Do not let him break your resolve. Rhina nodded, eyes shining with a swirl of anger and sorrow. I won't. Not this time. The final departure was quick. Half the resistance would remain behind to defend the base, the other half dividing into two squads, one to create diversions near the old highways, and the second, smaller group to infiltrate Mistveil Tower. As they set off under cover of darkness, Bren felt the gravity of the mission deepen. Overhead, clouds swirled, hiding the moon, making the mountainous route all the more treacherous. In the hush of night, footsteps and hushed radio chatter carried across jagged cliffs as they pressed on, each step drawing them closer to the confrontation that could reshape Earth's destiny forever. The ascent toward Mistveil Tower took the better part of the night. They moved along rugged, overgrown trails that once served local hikers before the Adarans arrived. Now only contraband smugglers and renegades dared traverse them. In the distance, columns of smoke rose where Naraya's diversion team had presumably begun their sabotage, luring away chunks of Kolar's forces. Occasionally, the flash of distant explosions lit the horizon, followed by faint echoes that rumbled across the mountains. Eventually, Bren, Rhina, Ewan, and a handful of resistance fighters arrived at a ridgeline overlooking Mistvale Tower. A mixture of old Earth and sleek Ataran architecture jutted from the rocky plateau, a tall, cylindrical structure ringed by smaller satellite dishes. The lower half, constructed of concrete and glass, reflected the faint glow of perimeter lights. Above that rose a latticework of Ataran metallic spines. A faint hum vibrated in the air, hinting at the energy flows within. Bren recalled how, before the Ataran's arrival, this facility was a broadcast station for local news and emergency alerts. Now it served as a crucial node in the Earth-wide compliance network, a vantage from which Kalar could begin final integration. Standing at that vantage point, the group scanned for guards. The tower's base bristled with armed sentries, some obviously Ataran, others human but wearing vacant, glossy expressions reminiscent of neural control. Bren recognized the type, people optimized to the point of losing their free will. Ewan cursed under his breath. There must be at least a dozen watchers out here. They'll spot us long before we can approach the main door. Rhina swallowed. Then we don't use the front door. There's a service entrance on the east side near the generator panels. We used to have backup power lines feeding this place in case of blackouts. That corridor might still be intact. A female resistance fighter with close-cropped hair and a rifle at her side spoke up. I'll take a small group and draw their attention away. You three slip in through the generator panels while they're distracted. Are you sure? Bren asked, concerned for her safety. She set her jaw. Part of the plan, right? We knew we'd need a diversion. Just make sure it's worth it. He nodded solemnly, then turned to Rhina and Ewan. Let's get into position. Quietly, they circled around the tower's perimeter, picking their way through scrub brush and rocky outcrops. The tension coiled in Bren's stomach like a living thing, fed by each glimpsed motion of patrolling guards. His mind raced with contingency plans. Where to hide if the infiltration was compromised. How to protect Rhina if firefight erupted. How to keep Ewan's gear intact. A soft click of a radio earpiece indicated the other team was in place. Almost at once, a series of sharp gunshots cracked the stillness, drawing the watchers' attention to the tower's western edge. Shouts rang out, floodlights swiveled, and a volley of return fire streaked across the yard. Go, hissed Ewan. Bren led them in a crouching sprint across the open stretch of ground. Hard hammering, he pressed his shoulder to a concrete wall as they reached the tower's side. Smoke drifted from the ongoing firefight to the west, accompanied by bursts of light that briefly illuminated the tower's flank. There, Rhina whispered, pointing to a recessed panel half hidden behind a tangle of metal piping. Ewan hurried to open it, hacking the electronic lock with a device from his belt. The lock blinked green, and the panel slid open, revealing a dark corridor lined with thick cables. They slipped inside. The door closed behind them with a quiet hiss. Instantly, the sound of gunfire dulled, replaced by the low drone of machinery. Dim emergency lights flickered along the corridor's ceiling, reflecting off puddles of leaked coolant. The metallic tang of old wiring and disinfectant wafted through the air. Bren raised his rifle, scanning for signs of movement. Let's keep going, he murmured. We have to reach the control center near the top. That's where we can plug in your rig, Ewan. Rhina nodded, her features tense. My father will be near that center. If a phase Omega is imminent, he'll want to personally oversee it. Her voice quivered slightly, and Bren gave her a reassuring glance. She had every reason to fear facing Kolar again, but the steel in her eyes said she wouldn't back down. They climbed deeper into the tower's labyrinth. The corridor led into what looked like an old server room. Rows of dusty server racks hummed with partial life, some replaced or augmented by glossy Ataran consoles that glowed with eerie greenish light. Broken cables snaked across the floor, and the musty smell of neglect clashed with the hum of advanced systems. No guards yet. Perhaps their infiltration was working, or perhaps Commander Vals's team hadn't arrived. Bren knew it was only a matter of time before an alarm would be raised. They needed to move quickly. They found a stairwell, ascending flight after flight. Sweat beaded on Bren's brow, and Rhina's breath grew ragged. Her leg injury slowed her pace, but her expression was resolute. Ewan followed, carrying the cumbersome code interface pack. The building's architecture shifted from old Earth concrete to sleek Ataran metal plating as they climbed. At several landings, they spotted digital signs indicating restricted zones. One sign blinked, Compliant Synchronization Lab, authorized personnel only. The further they climbed, the stronger Bren's sense of foreboding grew. The corridor walls pulsed with faint luminescence, reminiscent of living tissue rather than inert materials. This was top-tier Ataran design, bridging the organic and the mechanical. "We're nearing the central hub," Rhina said in a hush, pressing a hand to one glowing panel. "Everything is connected here. Energy, data, even biological feedback loops. If we can access the main console, we can hijack the broadcast array." Ewan nodded, eyes darting over the panel's readouts. "One last flight up. Let's hurry." They emerged onto an expansive observation floor. Transparent walls offered a dizzying view of Mistveil's mountainous landscape, bathed in gloom and sporadic flashes of muzzle fire far below. A cluster of Ataran consoles formed a central ring in the room. An enormous holographic display flickered overhead, showing multiple Earth regions, cityscapes, farmland grids, oceans dotted with solar rigs. Streams of data scrolled across each feed. At the center stood a man whose green skin radiated an almost otherworldly glow, Kolar. He was tall, his posture rigid with authority, clad in ceremonial Ataran robes that glistened like liquid emerald. His gaze was fixed on the holographic Earth, lips curved into a pensive smile that sent chills down Bren's spine. Two armed guards stood at his side, one human, one Ataran, both sporting that same disquieting vacancy in their eyes. As Bren, Rhina, and Ewan stepped onto the floor, all three turned in unison. Kolar's expression shifted from calculation to mild surprise, then to recognition tinged with cold amusement. "Rhina Hell," he said, voice carrying an almost paternal warmth. "I knew you were determined, but I didn't expect you here in person. You should have stayed hidden." Rhina's stance faltered only a fraction, but she recovered. "Father, stop this madness before it destroys everything." Kolar arched an elegant brow, his glowing eyes flicking to Bren and Ewan. "You've brought a rescue man and a half-baked coder to challenge the entire Directorate's greatest triumph? Rhina Hell, you always had such potential. It pains me to see you squander it." A rush of protective anger coursed through Bren. He raised his rifle. "We're not here to debate. We're here to end your twisted version of perfection." Kolar gave a small chuckle, tinged with genuine curiosity. "Oh? And you think you can do that by storming this tower with a handful of rebels? Even now, compliance protocols are hours, perhaps minutes, from total activation." Rhina took a trembling breath. "That's why we'll stop you. We have the reconfiguration codes." At that, Kolar's gaze sharpened. "The data crystal. Hand it over, child, before you make a catastrophic mistake." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The holographic Earth spun slowly overhead, while the distant thud of explosions reminded them that a war raged just outside. Bren glanced at Ewan, who subtly shifted, preparing to reach the main console. But Kolar's eyes were too keen. One gesture from him, and the two guards drew lethal Ataran energy blades, the edges humming with a menacing crackle. Rhina held her ground. "You claim to save humanity, but all you're doing is stealing their will," she said, voice gaining firmness. "You nearly convinced me it was benevolent, that by guiding their evolution, we'd spare them from conflict. But you're taking everything that makes them unique. Us unique." Kolar sighed as if discussing a stubborn child. "What you call unique, I call inefficient. We have watched Earth for decades, Renahel. Humanity's chaos, their short-sightedness, their penchant for violence. Without guidance, they will tear themselves apart again. Or worse, they'll drag us down with them. This integration ensures survival for both species." Bren clenched his jaw, aiming his weapon at the nearest guard. "Survival by turning everyone into mindless puppets? Doesn't sound like living." Kolar's gaze flicked to Bren. "And you, the unoptimized human, so proud of your scars and your old ways. You refuse our cures, cling to your illusions of heroism. But how many truly benefit from your archaic methods? When was the last time you saved more than a handful from a disaster? Meanwhile, we ended global pandemics, eradicated famine. Our track record is undeniable." A mix of rage and sorrow swelled in Bren's chest. He thought of the vacant expression on his mother's face after treatment, of the subtle dread creeping over every conversation in his old community. They took our struggles, yes, but they also took our spirit. The tension snapped when Kalar gestured, and the two guards lunged. The Ataran guards swung the energy blade in a smooth, lethal arc, forcing Bren to dive aside. He rolled across the polished floor, firing a desperate shot from his rifle. Sparks flew as the projectile glanced off the guard's armor. Rhina scrambled behind a console, her sidearm trembling in her grip. The human guard pivoted toward Ewan, who frantically tried to protect the code interface pack. "Keep them off me!" Ewan cried, backpedaling to avoid the slash of the crackling blade. Bren vaulted upright, forcing the Ataran guard to focus on him. He ducked a second slash, hearing the blade sizzle through the air. Then he slammed the butt of his rifle into the guard's midsection. The blow staggered the guard just enough for Bren to deliver a close-quarter shot that tore through the guard's chest armor. With a choked gasp, the guard collapsed, shimmering blood pooling on the floor. Meanwhile, Rhina emerged from behind the console, raising her sidearm with trembling determination. She fired at the human guard, who sidestepped gracefully as though guided by an unseen hand. A line of silver charges spat from the guard's weapon in retaliation. One grazed Rhina's arm, drawing a cry of pain. Fury ignited in Bren. He whipped around to see Collar, calmly observing from behind the main console. No more watchers. If they could defeat this last guard, they might have seconds to initiate the wave. Ewan ducked another slash and managed to roll behind a secondary station. The guard, momentarily distracted, turned to pursue. Seizing the opening, Bren rushed forward. He tackled the guard from behind, wrestling for control of the blade. For an instant, it vibrated between them, dangerously close to Bren's neck. Summoning all his strength, he twisted the guard's arm, forcing the energy blade downward. A hiss of ozone filled the air as the blade tore through the guard's torso. The vacant eyes glazed over and the body crumpled. Chest heaving, Bren looked up. Kolar's lips thinned in disappointment. "You've killed my men," he said quietly. "I had hoped you'd see reason." Rhina's voice shook with suppressed emotion. "It's done, Father. Your personal guard can't protect you anymore." He stepped away from the console, raising his empty hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "If you think killing two guards and plugging in a code solves everything, you're mistaken. I am this project, child. I have fail-safes. Even if you disrupt the local network, the global process is already in motion." Before anyone could respond, a new presence stormed in through the elevator at the rear of the chamber. Commander Vaus, flanked by a half-dozen of his hybrid soldiers. Their entrance cast an imposing shadow across the flickering consoles. "Not so fast," Vaus hissed, leveling an energy rifle at Ewan. "Step away from the equipment." Bren felt his gut twist. Could they face more specialized soldiers? The last two guards were formidable enough, and they barely survived. Rhina, pressing a hand to her bleeding arm, looked at Bren with growing panic. Kolar's expression relaxed at Vaus's timely arrival. "Ah, Commander, it appears my daughter and her companions have misplaced their sense of caution. Detain them, but leave my dear child alive. She needs to see the outcome of her defiance." Vaus sneered, gesturing for his soldiers to fan out. "You heard him. Anyone who resists, shoot." The tension pressed in like a vice. Bren's mind raced, searching for any advantage. We have the crystal, the partial decode, the console, but we're surrounded. He glanced at Ewan, who looked similarly cornered, his eyes darting to the console behind him. Rhina locked eyes with Bren, a silent question passing between them. "Can we still initiate the wave?" She clutched the data crystal so tightly her knuckles went pale. Ewan had the interface pack. If they could just get a few seconds. There was no time to plan a measured strategy. Instead, Bren lunged, firing a burst at Vaus's squad. The shots scattered the soldiers for a heartbeat, buying Ewan a moment to drop behind the console and slam in the code interface's connectors. Sparks leapt from the station as mismatched Earth and Ataran tech attempted to communicate. "Stop him!" Vaus roared. But in the same breath, Rhina rose, her luminous skin flickering between fear and resolve. She staggered to the console next to Ewan, placing the crystal into a specialized slot. The entire structure hummed with an otherworldly pitch. Kolar's eyes widened. "No!" he thundered, stepping forward. "Commander, shoot her now!" Time warped into chaos. Vos fired, but Bren dove in front, catching the shot in his vest. A jolt of searing pain tore through him, but the vest absorbed enough energy to keep him alive. He gasped, knees buckling, while behind him Reyna locked the crystal into place. Ewan mashed a final sequence of keys. A dazzling beam of pale light erupted from the console, enveloping Reyna and the nearest occupant, Bren. The rest of the chamber fell away, replaced by a kaleidoscope of sensory input that roared through Bren's mind. This was the neural handshake, the synergy Rena had spoken of. In that moment, Bren felt everything. He touched Reyna's memories, her childhood illusions, the day she realized her father's grand plan was a nightmare, her guilt at the sabotage that hurt some of her own people. At the same time, Reyna glimpsed Bren's rescues, his heartbreak over his mother's vacant optimization, the stubborn hope that humankind's flaws were worth preserving. Their hearts pounded in unison, forging a bond that transcended species. The chamber's physical reality snapped back into focus for Bren, though his consciousness now pulsed with a strange duality, connected to Reyna. They were one mind and two bodies, linked by the living key that bridged human grit and Ataran insight. Reyna's golden eyes burned with the same shared comprehension, radiating an inner power that made Kolar recoil. Lights on the consoles blazed. Alarms shrieked. The crystal's reconfiguration wave shot through the tower's broadcast array, merging with the global compliance signals. Instead of a tidy override Kolar had designed, a new sequence flooded every node. Valsa's soldiers twitched, confusion rippling across their faces. Their stiff, synchronized movements faltered. One dropped his rifle. Another stared at his hands as if waking from a dream. The entire squad stood in disarray. Kolar stared, fury twisting his features into something savage. "You imbeciles," he snarled at his newly disoriented soldiers. "Return to your protocols." But their vacant obedience was gone. Behind him, the holographic Earth display flickered, lines of code rewriting themselves in real time. City by city, the compliance parameters deactivated, replaced by a wave that maintained essential infrastructure but severed neural overrides. Freed from mental shackles, optimized humans from the largest metropolis to the smallest mountain hamlet blinked, disoriented, reclaiming their minds. In the tower, Ewan's console beeped as wave after wave of data confirmed the transformation was spreading. Bren felt Reyna's surge of relief, echoing in his own mind. It's working. But Kolar's meltdown was far from over. He lunged at the console, hands crackling with a shock of Ataran energy, some hidden augment, or perhaps an advanced sidearm integrated into his garments. Sparks spewed from the console as he attempted to forcibly disrupt the broadcast. Nearing collapse from the energy shot, Bren willed himself forward. He had to protect Reyna. The floor beneath him swam as adrenaline waned, but their shared bond gave him renewed strength. He grabbed Kolar's arm mid-swing, ignoring the burning jolt that raced up his muscles. "Your dream ends here," Bren ground out. Kolar's eyes blazed. "My dream is to save both the species from themselves. You betray that, you doom us all." Their struggle carried them dangerously close to the console's edge. Sparks leapt from the overloading machinery. Ewan scrambled to safeguard the code pack, while Valsa's men, now free-willed, backed away in shock. The entire place seemed on the verge of meltdown. At that moment, a new figure entered, stepping off the elevator. Naraya. She and her small reinforcement squad must have breached the tower in time to see the final confrontation. With liquid grace, Naraya closed the distance. Pain flickered in her gaze as she witnessed Kolar's madness. "This is not the mission we embarked on when we first arrived on Earth," she said, voice trembling. "It was supposed to be mutual uplift, not tyranny." Kolar sneered. "Your precious illusions. I was left with the burden of leadership while you fled and fomented rebellion. Now see what that rebellion has wrought. Total chaos." Reyna, clinging to the console, retorted, "It's not chaos, it's freedom." Kolar let out a howl, channeling energy for one last devastating strike. A bolt of raw Ataran power lashed at Reyna. Instinctively, Bren swung to intercept, but Naraya acted faster. She dove, colliding with Kolar and knocking him sideways. His energy blast tore a gash through the holographic projector overhead. sending bits of metal cascading. For a heartbeat, father and mother locked eyes. Then Caller slammed into the console, recoiling from the feedback surge. A brilliant flash erupted, momentarily blinding everyone. When Bren's vision cleared, he saw Kolar slumped, unconscious or worse, near the shattered console. Panting, Rhina teetered, nearly losing her balance. Bren caught her, leaning them both against the console. Naraya crouched over Kolar's prone form, tears slipping down her cheeks. She pressed trembling fingers to his neck. "He's alive," she said quietly, but his neural augments overloaded. Ewan, eyes wide, checked the console displays. The wave was still broadcasting, unstoppable now that it had begun. All across the planet, the compliance programming was unraveling while critical support systems remained intact, precisely as they'd hoped. Outside the broken glass walls, dawn broke over the mountains, painting the horizon in soft gold. The final echoes of gunfire subsided. Vaus and his men stood on the sidelines, looking utterly lost without directives. One of them, a young woman, gazed at her trembling hands as if discovering them anew. At the heart of it all, Bren and Rhina clung to each other. Their minds, still interlinked, felt the swirl of humanity's collective awakening. Pain, joy, confusion, real emotions flooding back into every corner of the world. "We did it," the thought reverberated between them, an exultant choir of two. 5 years later, the old tower stood as a testament to hard-won victory. Much had changed since that fateful night. No longer a husk of oppression, Mistveil Tower had been repurposed into a cooperative research center where humans and Atarans, both fully conscious and free, pursued joint projects to heal the planet. Global society took time to stabilize. The immediate aftermath of the wave saw mass confusion, people emerging from forced optimization, reeling from the emotional and cognitive whiplash. Some advanced Ataran equipment malfunctioned without the compliance protocols. But with the reconfiguration wave, essential utilities remained functional, and the worst catastrophes were averted. Little by little, trust had to be rebuilt. In the years that followed, mother and father chose drastically different paths. Naraya assumed a leadership role in a new interspecies council dedicated to mutual progress. Kolar, stripped of his authority and grappling with the failure of his grand plan, underwent a rehabilitation program of his own, one focused on empathy and accountability rather than forced compliance. He lived quietly now, studying the very chaos he once tried to eliminate, seeking a gentler understanding of Earth's destiny. At a modest cabin perched on Greyblade Peak, restored and expanded with a blend of reclaimed wood and sleek Ataran materials, Bren and Rhina found their life's calling. Far from the illusions of a perfect utopia, they dedicated themselves to rescue work that combined the best of both worlds. Ataran medical breakthroughs without hidden manipulations, and human tenacity unsoftened by complacency. On this particular morning, sunlight filled the cabin's open-air porch. Bren finished installing a new solar cell array, one that Ewan had helped design. Its folds were efficient, yet free of any binding subroutines. Nearby, a lively child bounded across the porch. Talia, barely 4 years old, grinned with mischievous delight. She had Bren's hair color and Rhina's golden-flecked eyes. Her skin sometimes shimmered faintly green when she felt strong emotions, a living tapestry of her dual heritage. Rhina emerged from inside, balancing a baby boy on her hip. Solon. He cooed, reaching for a glimmer of sunlight. He bore a deeper shade of green skin, reminiscent of Kolar, though his bright gaze was all curiosity and warmth. "Breakfast ready," Rhina announced, smiling at Bren. He wiped his brow, stepping down from the porch rail. "Think these new panels will hold up?" She nodded, pressing closer so that Solon could cling to his father's arm. "If not, we'll fix them again." That's the beauty of genuine collaboration. Her eyes sparkled, a direct echo of the unwavering bond they'd forged 5 years ago. Their consciousnesses no longer merged, but the afterglow of that connection lingered in subtle ways, shared instincts, mutual empathy. Talia tugged at Bren's pant leg. "Papa, tell me again about how you and Mama stopped the bad guys at the big tower." Rhina gave a playful groan. "Not that story again. You've heard it 100 times. "I want to hear it anyway," Talia insisted, bouncing impatiently. Bren and Rhina exchanged a knowing look. He ruffled Talia's hair, then started in a storyteller's voice. Well, it began with a huge explosion on the mountain, when I was just a stubborn rescue climber who didn't trust fancy tech. Laughter echoed through the cabin, blending with the crisp mountain air. Outside, the forest thrived, free of any ominous hum of compliance. Across the planet, communities still struggled, debated, and discovered. But for the first time in decades, each step was taken by choice, not programming. And in that imperfect freedom lay the greatest hope. For humans and Atarans alike, no utopia existed here, but a better reality was being built, day by day, rescue by rescue, choice by choice, proving that true progress came not from dominating flaws, but embracing them in the search for something shared and deeply human. Looking back on this entire journey, from the fiery rescue to the final triumphant wave of freedom, one thing stands out above all else: the enduring power of hope in human and Ataran determination. Despite the looming threat of forced conformity, our characters discovered that trust, empathy, and courage are what truly bring about real change. Every moment of danger revealed a deeper bond between them, proving how different species could unite to safeguard each other's dreams. In my view, this tale reminds us that no matter how dire the odds, compassion and collaboration can overcome even the most rigid designs for control. It's a story of flawed beings who persevere, and of a future shaped by those who refuse to surrender their individuality. If you found inspiration here, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Share your favorite moments or any lessons you took away. Let's discuss together and keep this spirit of hope alive.